2 years later, she had clarity she simply didn't have then, and some of what she agreed to couldn't be undone. That's the nature of irreversible decisions. They close doors, not always the wrong doors, but closed doors nonetheless. One of the most surprising things I see is that people spend enormous energy worrying about decisions that can actually be changed later, while giving very little attention to decisions that cannot. The goal of today's episode is to help you tell the difference. Let's define the two categories clearly.
Welcome to Navigating Wealth with Wisdom, hosted by Carol Eddy, CFP. This is an independent podcast not affiliated with Money Concepts Capital Corporation. All securities offered through Money Concepts Capital Corporation. Member FINRA and SIPC.
8 months after her husband died, Diane sat across from me and said something I hear more often than you might expect. I wish someone had told me I didn't have to decide so quickly. A few months earlier, she had sold an asset that had been in her husband's family for decades. At the time, it felt responsible. Everyone around her agreed it was the logical thing to do. Her attorney thought it made sense. Her accountant didn't raise a concern, and even her closest friends said it seemed right. But once it was gone, Diane realized something important. The asset wasn't the problem. It was the timing. And unlike most decisions she faced in the previous year, this one couldn't simply be revisited later. That's what we're talking about today, the difference between decisions that can be changed and decisions that can't. Here's something I've noticed over many years of working with women navigating this season. The decisions that create the most lasting difficulty aren't usually the big dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones. Made in a meeting that felt routine, a conversation that felt helpful, a moment when saying yes felt easier than asking for more time. 4 months after her husband's passing, a client found herself sitting in a conference room looking at paperwork she barely had the energy to read. The business interests had always been something her husband had managed. She didn't want the responsibility. She didn't want the meetings. She didn't want one more thing to think about at the end of the day that already felt impossible. So when someone suggested selling ownership interest, she agreed. Not because it was necessarily wrong, but because she was exhausted. 2 years later, she had clarity she simply didn't have then, and some of what she agreed to couldn't be undone. That's the nature of irreversible decisions. They close doors, not always the wrong doors, but closed doors nonetheless. One of the most surprising things I see is that people spend enormous energy worrying about decisions that can actually be changed later, while giving very little attention to decisions that cannot. The goal of today's episode is to help you tell the difference. Let's define the two categories clearly. An irreversible decision is one where once made, it is difficult or impossible to return the prior position. The consequences, financial, legal, or relational, are permanent or very costly to undo. Examples include selling an asset, liquidating a retirement account, changing beneficiary designations, completing a large gift, transferring real estate, surrendering a life insurance policy, or dissolving a business interest. A reversible decision is one where the status quo can be maintained, or a change can be undone without significant loss. Examples include leaving accounts as they are for now, continue with existing investments, maintaining current advisor relationships while you evaluate, staying in the home until you're ready to decide, and keeping insurance policies active while you assess your full picture. Here is the structural insight I want you to carry from today. In year one, most of what feels urgent is actually reversible. The house isn't going anywhere. The investment accounts aren't deteriorating simply because you haven't reorganized them. The estate plan doesn't have to be rewritten this month. What feels like urgency often is someone else's preference for efficiency, and efficiency is not the same as wisdom. The more permanent the decision, the slower the pace should be. That's not indecision, that's judgment. The trade-off here is between speed and clarity. Acting quickly has an appeal. It feels decisive. It reduces the emotional weight of unresolved questions, and sometimes, in genuine financial emergencies, it is necessary. But most situations in year one are not emergencies. They are transitions, and transitions deserve to be paced. Here's what I want you to understand about the pressure you may be feeling right now. Understanding and action are not the same thing. One creates confidence, the other simply creates movement. A decision can feel lighter in the moment it's made. That sensation is real. But that relief doesn't mean the decision was ready to be made. The cost of waiting, when done thoughtfully, is usually minimal. Markets fluctuate, yes, but the risk of holding a well-structured situation through a period of grief and transition is almost always lower than the risk of making permanent decisions under emotional pressure. The cost of moving too quickly is harder to quantify, but it is real. Tax consequences that weren't anticipated, assets sold at the wrong time, family dynamics complicated by distributions made before everyone had a clear picture. My general guidance, and this is education, not personal financial advice, is to treat every decision with the permanent consequences as one that requires your full understanding before you agree to it. If you cannot explain the decision back to yourself in plain language, you may not be ready to make it. Before we close, I want to leave you with one thought. Some decisions can be revisited, others cannot. Wisdom isn't knowing the future. It's knowing which decisions deserve more of your patience. If there's one thing I'd like to give you today, it's permission to distinguish between a decision that must be made and a decision that simply wants to be finished. Those are not the same thing. Diane understood that eventually, and when she came back to me a year later, clearer and more grounded, she made several decisions she'd been putting off. She made them well. She made them on her own timeline. She told me, I finally stopped letting, quote, urgency make my choices for me. Here's your question for this episode. Is there a decision in front of you right now that feels urgent? And if so, is that urgency coming from the decision itself or from the discomfort of not having decided yet? Sit with that. If today's episode resonated, I'd invite you to book a call with me at moneyconcepts.com/CEDDY. And if you're navigating the season and feel like conversation might be helpful, the link to reach me is in the show notes. Thank you for being here.
Navigating Wealth with Wisdom is hosted by Carol Eddy, Certified Financial Planner. A special thank you to everyone who made this episode possible. For more information, visit moneyconcepts.com/CEDDY. This is an independent podcast not affiliated with Money Concepts Capital Corporation. All securities offered through Money Concepts Capital Corporation. Member FINRA and SIPC.